My name is Melanie Hart. I'm the Senior Director of the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And I am absolutely thrilled to have here today Ambassador Nick Burns to talk about what is going on in U.S.-China relations. As we all know, there's been a lot of drama in U.S.-China relations in past weeks. You know, we had tariffs are on, tariffs are off, presidential meetings are on, presidential meetings are off. And it can be hard to figure out what's happening and to keep that straight. So we thought no better time and no better person to come in a week before the presidents, maybe not, will meet on the sidelines of APEC in South Korea. So Ambassador Nick Burns, who needs no introduction, but just for formality's sake, is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, as well as a faculty affiliate at Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. But just as importantly, if not more so for today, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2001 to 2025, leading public servants from 48 U.S. government agencies at the U.S. mission to China, overseeing one of the U.S.'s most important and challenging bilateral relationships. You saw a lot of ups and downs.
We did.
And drama during your time as well. And you have a long U.S. government career at NATO as State Department spokesman that predated your time in China. But particularly for us, you know, you've been in the room with the people who President Trump will possibly be meeting in a week. So, you know, just to really get us off started from the beginning, we just saw this whiplash. You know, after what seemed like a couple of weeks of maybe calm, maybe stability, we saw the U.S. Commerce Department tighten up the way that it enforces our export controls. We saw the U.S. put some port fees in place. We saw China roll out new critical mineral controls. China put port fees in place. Trump threatened another 100% tariffs. Things seem to be ratcheting up. They seem to have calmed down a little bit. What is your take on what just happened and what the dynamic is?
Business as usual in the U.S.-China relationship. But first I want to say, Melanie, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the work that you are doing here to promote, an American conversation on China in the United States and here in Washington. And I think the Atlantic Council has been a leading voice. And so it's good to see everything you've done for the U.S. government now be translated into this institution. So thanks for the invitation. I would say, I hope that President Trump and President Xi will meet in Seoul on the margins of the APEC meeting. I mean, given the fact that in the current setup of the Chinese government, where it's essentially ruled by one person, President Xi Jinping, we have to interact with President Xi to get things done and to discuss difficult issues and discuss opportunities in the relationship. We certainly found that in the Biden administration. President Biden had 3 summit meetings, phone calls, video meetings. You have to have this connectivity between the two governments. I think on the trade, the whiplash question, I just say this. I think it was inevitable from the beginning that the Chinese were determined to meet the United States blow for blow in the initial phase of the trade war. There was never going to be a scenario where China was going to end up on the losing end of a very public, globally focused trade discussion, trade fight with the United States. And that was obvious to me after our presidential election last November. In my last 2.5 months in China, it was obvious that the Chinese were gearing up for this. That's point one. Point two, we always found in our administration that the power of the United States and our ability to work with China would be enhanced if we worked with Japan and South Korea and Australia and, of course, India, our great strategic partner, as well as the countries of the European Union and NATO, because they began to think very strategically about China during the last 4 years. And so I think it was unfortunate that we didn't line up with them from the very beginning of this trade war. In fact, I think the problem was that we were putting, on Liberation Day, we put very high tariffs on all those allied countries, making them, I think, probably disinclined to join this fight with the Chinese. Having said all that, I really think President Trump's been right to raise the issues he's raised. The issues that you and I and a lot of other people, I think Josh Lipsky is here, he is, of the Atlantic Council, who knows a lot about, and is an expert on the tariff issues. We've been talking for a generation about intellectual property theft. I issued as ambassador reports every year, along with Catherine Tai, our trade representative, about Chinese, the real problems that the Chinese had in not enforcing their own IP laws, forced technology transfer, the dumping of Chinese manufactured products below the cost of production on the rest of the world, which forced President Biden to raise tariffs in May 2024, 100% on Chinese EVs, 50% on Chinese semiconductors, 25% on lithium batteries. I mean, the irony here is, for a Washington that is normally, on most days of the week, very much divided, I think you and I would agree there is a bipartisan consensus on China. We in the Biden administration implemented all the Trump tariffs from President Trump's first term in office, and President Trump has maintained the Biden tariffs. This, I think, is a strength of the United States. And so I think President Trump's been right to raise the issues that he's raised. He's been right to be tough-minded. I certainly want President Trump and Scott Bessent, our Treasury Secretary, to succeed, because right now China has projected for 2025, a $1.2 trillion trade surplus with the rest of the world. Manufacturing, what's Chinese percentage of manufacturing globally? 32, 33%. These are not sustainable, and we need a better deal from the Chinese. So I really hope that President Trump's going to be able to succeed in pushing the Chinese to a better deal. If there's going to be a trade deal by next week, we should probably talk about that.
So, one of the fascinating things about Trump administrations is his negotiations play out in the public eye. There's less...
Very transparent.
Very transparent.
Yeah.
There's less behind closed doors and more truth social. So it creates this opportunity to kind of watch very closely his style in dealing with China. And then you see China being less behind closed doors than they normally would be to react to that. And we can kind of see more of the dynamic, perhaps, than one would have seen in the Biden administration publicly. How do you think the two sides are playing this right now? Do you think the U.S., you mentioned that it would be better to go with allies and partners. Sure. That might be one constructive criticism. Yeah. Do you think that either side, particularly with this sudden ratcheting up that we just saw, is either side misplaying it?
Well, I think, in a negotiation like this, where the two heads of government, our heads of state, are so publicly identified with the ultimate deal, and where, in a negotiation like this, neither of them is going to make an agreement where they turn out to be the loser. I think it's become almost a test of wills. And that's unfortunate, because you want to try to take emotion and political standing out of trade negotiations. You want this to be more clinical, and it's not clinical at all. I also don't think that this is going to be a normal trade agreement if it can be reached, whether it's 8 days from now or 8 months from now. This isn't, normally in the last 50 or 60 years, our trade agreements are worked out over several years, lots of lawyers involved, lots of impenetrable language that's very difficult for lay people to understand, and commitments. And in the past, whether it was the GATT or the World Trade Organization, binding commitments. I think this is largely going to be, if any kind of deal is cobbled together next week, a series of commitments without binding language, legalistic language, and sometimes on issues not normally associated with trade agreements. So, for instance, TikTok has been a big part of the discussion. Fentanyl, very important issue for us, leading cause of death in our society, Americans 18 to 49. We need China to do more, the government, to crack down on the black market in China, which is exporting precursor chemicals to the drug cartels. Soybeans. That normally is part of a trade deal. China is the largest market for American agricultural exports. As recently as 2023-24, a fifth of all of our exports went to that one country. $41 billion in sales 2 years ago, $14 billion of which was soybeans, and this year, zero in terms of soybeans. So all this is going to be cobbled together. My best sense, and we were talking before we came on with this, is that we're not going to see a finished trade deal next week. Too little time. But if the two presidents could agree on certain principles that might bind the Chinese and Americans into a more normal trade discussion and relationship, and then ask Secretary Bessent, Vice Premier He Feng to go back to negotiations over the ensuing couple of months. Frankly, that's maybe the best we can expect, and that might not be a bad outcome, given how difficult and high volume, high decibel this disagreement has been over the last several months.
You know, to your point about difficult and high decibel, how do you assess the leverage between Washington and Beijing? We saw these fascinating statements in early 2025 that, you know, China has no leverage, they're dealing with the bad set of cards. I would not say that the evidence necessarily matched that. How do you assess the leverage between the two sides?
I think both sides have tried to deploy lots of leverage to try to the advantage of their negotiating position. You know, it was very clear from the outset the Chinese were going to play hardball and use the leverage that they clearly have, whether it's rare earths or the lithium battery, EV, supply chain, all of that, to our disadvantage. It was also very clear we were going to play the same game. This is not abnormal in global politics and in trade negotiations. This is normal behavior when we negotiate with Canada or the European Union, not just the Trump administration, but prior administrations. That was to be expected. I think that the miscalculation was that China didn't have real weight to throw around. It was obvious that they did. That opinion was not shared by some of the people in the administration. I think it's now clear that China has the leverage. But I do disagree with some of the press criticism of the Trump administration, that somehow they've been outboxed in this sparring match. You know, China deployed assets on their side, but the Trump administration responded each time. I think they've kind of negated each other in terms of influence. Both sides have used the issues they had that would create a more level playing field, and I think they're at a point now of trying to define what success is. And that's always important in any negotiation. When you begin it or you're in the middle of it, both sides have to agree on what the end game, the framework's going to look like. I don't know if they've agreed on that yet, which makes a deal by October 29th or 30th, next week in Seoul. I think it's a very tall mountain to climb.
I don't envy my NSC colleague, my NSC friends who won't be sleeping for the next week.
We remember what this is like in the end game.
You know, talking about next week, President Trump might be meeting Xi Jinping. Secretary Bessent has been meeting with his counterpart on the China side. Can you tell us a little bit about the cast of characters on the Beijing side that it seems like over the past, I've been working on China for 20 years now, and over time, the cast of characters that matter seems to have narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed so that it becomes, you know, Xi Jinping clearly most important, and those few senior leaders who he's delegating US policy to, they're harder to understand because they aren't the old America hands that we've known for, as we had in decades past. You've been in the room with them, I think probably more than anyone else in Washington, because you were in Beijing for a solid 4 years. You prepped all the meetings with Biden. You sat across the table and watched their interactions with Xi Jinping. You know, who passes the boss notes? Does the boss read them? What can you tell us about who's who and how we should look at and understand who's going to be sitting across the table from Trump?
First, in general, as an observation, this is a very good question, Melanie. You know, after my time in China, I have to say, these are very impressive people on the Chinese side. And I say that because we are competitors with them. And I felt very competitive. I felt that at the end of my time, I probably spent 80% of my time in China on the competitive edge, 20% on the cooperative edge, climate change, issues like that. And that's probably the right ratio for any American ambassador in China these days. But you have to, in an objective sense, recognize the government of China at the high level is filled with smart, experienced, capable people. That's who the adversary is, the competitor is across the table. President Xi, clearly in charge. I mean, it's interesting to reflect on Chinese history. Deng Xiaoping's great insight in the late 70s and early 80s was that Mao's one-man rule had not worked for China, particularly in almost destroying China during the Cultural Revolution, that there had to be a committee of equals and the standing committee. He tried to practice that, but China under President Xi Jinping is back to one-man rule. And interestingly, Xi Jinping, it might be a stronger leader than Mao was, because China today, infinitely stronger in 2025 as a competitor than Mao's China was in his last years in 1975 and 1976. So we start there with President Xi. He is the decision maker, he's the strategist, and all issues go to him. I think on the Chinese side below him, Vice Premier He Feng is in a very strong position. He and President Xi have a personal friendship and relationship that goes back more than 40 years to Xiamen, where they met, I think, when Vice Premier He Feng graduated from Xiamen University, when President Xi was then vice mayor of Xiamen. So they've come up the ranks together. And in a negotiation like this, you want your lead negotiator to be able to understand the leader, take instructions from the leader, know where the boundaries are. And Vice Premier He Feng is very effective in that regard. You have other people that you and I know, Liao Min, who's the Vice Minister of Finance, very capable, knowledgeable person. So I'm sure that Secretary Bessent and Jameson Greer are not underestimating at all the capabilities of this team. But I think the American team is strong too. I mean, frankly, I think Secretary Bessent has proven to be effective Treasury of the Secretary, the right person to lead these negotiations. Jameson Greer now, in his second iteration for President Trump, he was Deputy USTR in the first term, also someone who knows the issues inside and out. So I think our side matches the Chinese very well. And obviously we have a president who cares very deeply about tariffs, believes in them. And I think unusual for American presidents, I was trying to think of an antecedent. Do we have to go back maybe to Herbert Hoover to find a president so involved on the economic side of this relationship, which I think is a strength for our country? I think if you had to look at the 1,000 different issues on the US-China agenda, we've dealt with almost all of them. The economic trade issues and the technology issues are not peripheral the way they might have been deemed to be 20 years ago. They are center stage. And so I think the Trump team has given as well as it's gotten and received in terms of tactical posturing. And it may be they just need a little bit more time to put together a comprehensive deal that we would recognize as some kind of trade deal.
You have spent time with these counterparts yourself.
On the Chinese side.
Yeah, on the Chinese side, more so than anyone, I think. As a China scholar, when I read some of the writing coming out of the Chinese Communist Party these days, it's not exactly pro-American or nice. There's a lot of vilifying of the West, vilifying liberal values and the liberal international system, vilifying Washington in increasingly dramatic, emotional ways. Can you share a little bit, when the door closes, I know you've spoken publicly about the fact that there was not openness to meeting Americans. It was hard for Americans to get meetings around China.
Yeah.
How did you experience their style and dynamic and how they view the US?
So I've said some things that I truly believe, capable, well-educated, experienced people on the Chinese side. But what's the other side of the coin? This is a fearful time in China. The crackdown on individual rights goes way beyond what it was 15 or 20 years ago in this very authoritarian environment. You've seen the fact that many members of the Chinese military leadership, including just in the last several days, have been fired on corruption charges. The Minister of Foreign Affairs with whom I worked closely in my first year, Qin Gang, has disappeared for public view for 2 years, more than 2 years now. The Minister of Defense at that time, Li Shangfu, disappeared. There's been such a rotation of people summarily fired that it just tells you fearful time, a time of some instability in the government leadership. And that's something that we need to take note of. And I'm sure the Trump team obviously has taken note of this. I'd also say that if there's a weakness or an Achilles heel even in the Chinese leadership, if you look at the top tier, the members of the Standing Committee, the 24 members of the Politburo, the 205 members of, you think of concentric circles in the Chinese leadership, very few of the top leaders have had experience working in the private sector outside of China. Most of them have been part of the state enterprises in China, so they have a particular skill that comes with that and experience, but they don't have, say, the extraordinary international experience, private sector, public sector, of someone like Janet Yellen or Scott Bessent. And in a world where increasingly China is going to sink or swim based on its understanding of how global finance works, I think this is a weakness and a real challenge for the Chinese leadership. Look at some of the decisions they've made since 2021, cracking down on the Chinese private sector, which has created a lot of wealth in China and much of the job creation in China over the last 40 years. The fact that so many of the really top business leaders have had to leave China. Someone like Jack Ma. So I do think this is a weakness on the Chinese side. When it comes to trade, when it comes to international economics, when it comes to working across a broad expanse on these economic issues with the Koreans, the Japanese, very sophisticated about how the global economy works, the European Union, just to give you a couple of examples. So obviously, you've got to try to appreciate the competitor across the table. Those are just some basic thoughts about these people. Secretary Yellen and I spent parts of 6 days with Vice Premier He Lifeng in Guangzhou, in Beijing, in the spring of 2024, where Secretary Yellen was trying to convince the Chinese, don't go ahead with this massive push on what President Xi called the new productive forces, where they began to manufacture 2 to 3 times domestic demand and push the excess demand, artificially low prices, on the rest of the world. And it was remarkable to see in the spring and summer of 2024 who raised tariffs on China. And this shows that President Trump is not an outlier. President Trump is actually pushing on an open door. India raised tariffs. Turkey raised tariffs. South Africa, very close friend of China, raised tariffs on China. Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Canada, the United States of America, European Union. That's more than 50% of global GDP, well more than 50% of global GDP, said we don't want these low-priced, artificially low-priced manufactured exports in our country to kill our own domestic suppliers and grab market share. So I don't think the Chinese are playing a winning hand. I think that's actually the Trump hand, if you think about it globally, is the stronger hand if we can get to a final agreement. 2 more points. Here's what I hope doesn't happen. I think it's very important that the United States not give in to the very public demand we're hearing from China. We're reading it in the Financial Times and Wall Street Journal, that the United States either cease or limit its export controls and sanctions on those dual-use technologies that China desperately wants to import from our most sophisticated companies. The reason why President Biden, 3 years ago this month, decided to put export controls and severe limits on the ability of the United States companies, American companies, to export advanced semiconductors for AI purposes, we outlawed it, is because we don't want that technology to be available to the PLA to compete with our military in their push for power in the Indo-Pacific. So the Chinese are making a big ask. They want to basically free themselves of these restrictions that we have rightfully put on their economy, and we shouldn't give in. Second, and obviously, the Chinese have been going around, and we've talked about this, saying they want some adjustments to the historic American policy on Taiwan. And we should not give an inch on that issue. We have been remarkably consistent since February 1972. Every American president has honored that one China policy that includes the Taiwan Relations Act of January 1st, 1979, and obligations that we have towards the people of Taiwan and the Taiwan authorities. I think those would be the red lines that would really make this a failed negotiation. I can't believe that the administration would go there, but I think it bears saying because the Chinese have beat this drum so loudly over the last couple of months.
You know, you're talking about the interconnectedness of these issues, that some of which the U.S. wants on the table, some of which China wants on the table. China's pushing Taiwan asks, export control asks. President Trump has said he wants fentanyl, soybeans, and rare earths are his top 3 priorities. What do you think about the way the U.S. side is organized? It's hard for me, on the one hand, as someone who's worked at the State Department, the idea that our secretary runs the NSC too sounds kind of like a dream. But in reality, I can't imagine Secretary Blinken and Jake Sullivan being one job, looking back. Those are big jobs. And coordinating across agencies, from fentanyl to Taiwan to tariffs, it's hard for me to understand from the outside looking in, how is Besant supposed to do that? So what are your thoughts looking at what organization we can see on the U.S. side and weighing these different issues that cut across agencies?
Yeah, from my own career and just, in both Republican and Democratic administration, what works and what doesn't work when you're dealing with a really difficult competitor. In this case, the government of China, you do want one person to be in charge of the negotiation. So the fact that President Trump has clearly put Secretary Besant in charge, I think is a very good decision, with a very skillful deputy in Jameson Greer. So I think that team makes sense. The other thing that distinguishes this administration versus all others, at least since I go back to 1979-80 as an intern at Commerce and State, is that you have a much more activist president. That's not a bad thing. I mean, President Trump, very involved in the strategy, very involved in the tactics, very involved in being chief spokesperson, and that's not a criticism at all. And so, obviously, the administration has been reconfigured to reflect a president playing a much more activist role. I would say both on the public articulation of strategy, but also the tactics of the negotiation almost day by day, as much as one can have visibility into the Trump administration. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Secretary Rubio occupying 2 positions, or even more, maybe 4, that's a lot of work, but Secretary Kissinger did this back in 1973 and 74, and it's a tough thing to be National Security Advisor in the modern era, as well as Secretary of State. It probably means that the Secretary of State, if he's also National Security Advisor, is not free to travel as much and negotiate as much. And that might become more into public view when we get to the rest of the agenda on the U.S.-China relationship, because obviously the Trump team has been focused like a laser on trade. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the agenda with China, let's just review it very briefly. The PLA is trying to overtake the United States as the strongest military power in the Indo-Pacific. That is a generational, multi-generational challenge to how Americans have thought about our role in the world. We can't let that happen. And so you need a very activist Secretary of State and Defense to prosecute our case that if we keep our alliance structure in place, which we have to do, the allies are key here, we can prevent that from happening. That's just one issue in the agenda. It's the PLA pushing out in the Spratlys and Paracels against the Philippines and Vietnam, in the Taiwan Strait, where they violated the status quo since Speaker Pelosi's visit 3 and 3 years ago, in the Yellow Sea, making it very difficult for South Korea, and of course on the Himalayan border separating India and China, where we support the Indian position. This is a full agenda. And so that's just part of the relationship. And if you add to that the cyber aggressiveness of the Chinese government against American companies, American institutions, which Chris Wray, our former FBI director, talked about insistently in public in 2023, in 2024, the fact that the PLA is engaged in the largest buildup of any country's nuclear weapons force, and no transparency by the Chinese government, and no willingness to talk to anybody about it in the international system, we have our hands full.
Yeah.
And so when the tariff issue subsides, because we've reached hopefully some kind of agreement, you've got this set of national security issues that makes China the most significant competitor for the United States, I think, in the next couple of decades.
So Rubio is going to be really busy.
That's the moral of this story. That was my roundabout answer. He's going to be really busy.
So you staffed President Biden for 3 meetings with Xi Jinping.
3 summit meetings.
3 summit meetings. Yeah. What would you tell the current, President Trump's team? President Trump, let's assume, we all have to roll the dice, who's to say, but let's assume that they'll meet on the sidelines of the APEC in about a week's time. What, if you were in the Oval Office and had your 2 minutes with President Trump, what would your advice be on what to expect and how to approach this meeting?
So a few things. First of all, we can never underestimate the capacity of the government of China and their ambition. It was Lee Kuan Yew, who probably knew the American and Chinese leadership best, who said before his death, there was no question in his mind, China's objective was to overtake the United States as the strongest power in the Indo-Pacific. So can't underestimate this group of people. Number two, a certain amount of arrogance coming out of Beijing. That was very evident in my time, that I've witnessed just watching since I left Beijing in January. This incessant refrain, Asia for the Asians, i.e. the United States, and if we had the map and looked at where Hawaii and Alaska and Washington, Oregon, and California are, the United States should be out of Asia. Or the East is rising and the West is falling. And I think too many Chinese leaders, in my interactions with them, betrayed this sensibility that somehow we're yesterday's power. And our job is to disabuse them of that notion. And now that's important for the President of the United States to do. Third is that you've got this other big agenda that we've just talked about, the military competition, the tech competition, AI, quantum computing, biotech, our differences on human rights. Those issues are often tied to the trade issues. And you can't just sometimes negotiate trade and economics in a vacuum without reference to those issues. Sometimes you want to link them for our advantage. You want to withhold concessions in trade at some points because you need something else. So there's a bigger agenda out there. Final thing I'd say in my 2 minutes in the Oval Office would be this: be nice to your allies. If you measure the power of China against the United States, military power, tech power, economic power, Zhou Enlai's concept, the late, great Zhou Enlai, of soft power, it's pretty even. I would say the United States probably, and I think the Chinese would say probably more powerful, but even. But if you add to our side of the ledger, Japan, South Korea, India, the EU under Ursula von der Leyen is a strategic actor with the United States to try to balance Chinese power. We are infinitely more powerful when we work with our allies. And I found that out in Beijing, working with my friend Jorge Toledo, who was the EU ambassador, or Patricia Flohr, who was the German ambassador. We would team up on Xinjiang, on Tibet, on Hong Kong, on Chinese misbehavior on trade. And we were always more effective when we were pulling on the same oar. And I think that would be probably the most important advice, that the United States is the leader of these two great alliances, our treaty allies in the Pacific and NATO in Europe, and we can deploy those alliances effectively to limit Chinese power. But if you're questioning Canadian sovereignty repeatedly, or questioning Denmark's sovereignty in Greenland, or putting 50% tariffs on India, I was just in India 2 weeks ago, and heard a lot from the Indian leadership on this, we're going to be less successful. Be nice to your allies and work through them to limit Chinese power in the world.
So would another way to put that be the game, the outside game you play outside of that meeting room with allies and partners, would you say it's as important as what happens sitting inside of it?
I think it sometimes is, because again, sometimes the power balance between the United States and China is so narrow that we kind of come to a standstill. When you have the allies on your side, and they are like-minded with us, then we have the advantage. So on Liberation Day, if we had not, let's say hypothetically, if we could roll back the film and say we were not going to put those high tariffs on the EU or Canada or South Korea and Japan, they would have been willing to have formed an alliance with us on the trade misbehavior of the Chinese government. But since they were all put under the same policy of major historically high tariffs, I would imagine they felt disinclined to jump into the fray with us.
That's a really good point. So I have two more questions about the APEC meeting, and then we'll turn to the audience. So be thinking about the questions you'd like to ask, and folks watching online are welcome to send questions in to askac.org, I believe it is. So, one thing that we've been hearing a lot in DC over the past couple of weeks, past month or so in particular, is that the Beijing side is recognizing there's only so much time to tee up beautiful deliverables for APEC. So it sounds like some of the focus has shifted toward getting Trump to go to Beijing in first quarter 2026 so that China can achieve a more robust set of deliverables from those exchanges. And I just keep hearing over and over around DC that what China really wants is to get Trump to go to Beijing. Can you share what's the difference from China's perspective between meeting in South Korea and meeting in Beijing? Why would that be such a priority?
Well, the Chinese clearly remember that President Biden did not visit China in the 4 years of President Biden's term in office as President of the United States, number one. But that was by design. I mean, I think the president felt, and his advisors felt, and I certainly agreed, that meeting in neutral locations, the way we did, Bali in 2022, Lima in 2024, and San Francisco was the margins of APEC. President Xi did not come to Washington, D.C. We felt, given the competitive nature of this relationship, all the problems we had, better to meet and not have the fanfare that comes with a state visit by someone like President Xi to Washington. So the Chinese, of course, always want to be asked. And oftentimes, and you know this play by the Chinese, they'll say, well, at the request of this foreign leader, we agree to a meeting, or we agree to invite the foreign leader because they've asked us. I don't think we should give them that. Because of the full agenda that we've just discussed, all the issues beyond trade, it might be best to meet at a neutral location until you've got what you want. Or, you want to exact some compromises on the Chinese side before you agree to a spectacle, a visit to Beijing. These are kind of cardinal lessons of diplomacy that go back several thousand years.
It's another chip to play, basically.
It's another chip. Everything is negotiated in this relationship. And I have to say, there's very little trust, if any trust, between these two competing powers. I never felt that I could fully trust my Chinese interlocutors, and they certainly didn't display that towards me.
So before we turn to audience questions, if we were in Vegas and you had to make your bet, meeting or no meeting at APEC, and what would be some of the deliverables we would see? What would be your best guess?
Well, I'd like to hear Josh Lipsky's answer to this. Maybe he'll give it his odds, because Josh really knows trade and tariffs. I think that there should be a meeting 8 days from now. It is good for the two leaders to meet. We have to have connectivity with them. It's when you don't have connectivity that we have a problem. After Speaker Pelosi's visit, August 2nd, 2022, the Chinese froze 8 channels between us for 3 months. Then when we resurrected the channels, a strange balloon floated across the entire national territory of the United States.
This job is never boring.
And when President Biden rightfully ordered that strange balloon to be shot down in the territorial waters of the United States off the coast of South Carolina, I was called in. And they said, you're to blame, the United States. You caused this crisis by shooting down the balloon that had drifted from Alaska to South Carolina. And so, and then they boycotted meetings for another 3. You remember this, Melanie. And so when you don't have connectivity, when our Secretary of Treasury or State or Defense or our trade negotiator can't, or our ambassador can't have meetings, that doesn't help. In fact, in a relationship where our military forces, Chinese and American, are juxtaposed operationally in international waters, South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, God forbid if there's a collision, and we had one in 2001, you want to be able to have connectivity to deal with the crisis. And we didn't have that in large parts of 2022 and 2023. So my advice is always good to meet. I hope the leaders meet next week. But a tall mountain to climb probably to have a comprehensive trade deal worked out, given how far apart they appear to be right now.
Thank you for that. So we've got a lot of questions. So if I'll ask folks we have a microphone. Yep. So why don't we start right here at the front? And if you can state your name and affiliation.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. Could you clarify what you think some of the leading APEC leaders, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, should be doing? I mean, do they just have to wait until China and US clarify where they are, or how can they constructively be doing things over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, it's a logical question to ask. When the two largest economies are tangling with each other and haven't worked out the boundaries in what was last year a $642 billion two-way trade relationship in goods and services, the result of these negotiations are going to be a big deal for the global community. So you're asked the right question. In our administration, our view, and Secretary Tony Blinken articulated this very frequently when he traveled, particularly in the global south, is we're not asking countries to choose between the United States and China. We have enough self-confidence as Americans to know that we offer a lot to South Africa or Brazil or Sri Lanka. And if they want to have relations with China, okay, we may not think that's a good idea, but what's more important is our relationship with them. So I don't think Americans are usually successful if we go around the world warning countries to stay away from the other side, China, because China's a leading trade partner with Melanie, 140 countries around the world. They have a big presence. We talked about the fact $1.2 trillion trade surplus, China, with the rest of the world probably by the end of this calendar year. Those are the realities. So we have to offer something of value, and I think we do. So that's my roundabout way of answering your very good question. Neri.
Thank you.
Very good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I would like to publicly thank you for your service and also support of my family. I'm still in awe that you help us to end 20 years of family separation. Receiving my mother last year at a military base in Texas is once in a lifetime memorable event. Thank you. More on the issues that you've been discussing today. You're absolutely right about the restriction, and the previous administration's policy on the export control were spot on, but some of them have been reversed. And what would be the right balance when considering national security concern and also the economic competitiveness? When you look at the laws meant to be implemented, enforced, and when you listen to the businesses, they want to sell more chips and make money, and in the interest of the investors. Today in Washington, everybody literally wondering what would be the right balance. Do we continue to sell chips, knowing that the AI chips are inherently dual use? Or we need to have a new laws put in place and protect our long-term economic national security interests?
Well, I think, the Biden administration, President Biden was very clear about this. The national security interests of the United States in denying to China our most sensitive dual-use technology far exceed the interests of a single or one or two or three American companies. It is imperative that we outcompete the Chinese in terms of our military power and the power of our alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. And denying China these technologies, we were never under any belief that we could deny them that capability forever. We knew they would innovate, but we thought if we could slow them down by several years, it would be worth it. It's been worth it. And so I have to tell my students what Lenin said, and my students are young enough, I'm not talking about John Lennon, I'm talking about the other Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, the capitalists will sell us the rope from which we hang them. And that was basically our theory of the case in October of 2022. So I know this is disadvantageous for some American companies, but the interests of the United States government and the future of American power in the Indo-Pacific is far more important than just one company's balance sheet. That's a very direct view. Can I just say for Nuri, Nuri has been a very important voice on another national security issue, and that is human rights of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang and other parts of China. And Nuri's voice and that of his colleagues were really important, I think, to buttress our government's effort to try to convince the Chinese that, arresting and imprisoning more than 1 million people in Xinjiang between 2017 and 2019 was a crime against humanity. And what's been happening in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in Inner Mongolia, these are national security issues. And we talked, Melanie, about can you essentially negotiate trade in a vacuum? I don't see you can always do that. And that's why these issues are linked. And most administrations have wanted to link these very serious differences on human rights in one way or another to the overall progress in the relationship. And I hope the Trump team will do that. And it's just wonderful to see that your family's been reunited after a separation of 20 years. And we were proud to work with you. So thank you for being here.
And thank you for saying that. One of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, her brother, is currently detained. He's a Uyghur as well.
In
Thank
Xinjiang.
you for raising that, yeah.
The Chinese have now come out and said, various Chinese officials, including the party secretary in Xinjiang, they have told visitors, yes, we incarcerated 1 million people between 2017 and 19, after denying it. And now they've kind of, as Nuri knows very well, they've kind of reconstructed some of these cities and turned them into tourist destinations to cover up the crimes that they committed. And it's our responsibility to not let them get away with that. So I think the human rights issues, I thought that this relationship is in quadrants. The military challenges in the Indo-Pacific, the tech challenges, the economic challenges, and the human rights, and the human rights is not last. And that issue is kind of off the table right now. I would hope that the Congress and others could put these issues back on the table.
So over to Fred, our dear president at the Atlantic Council.
Nick, Mr. Ambassador, welcome
you.
back to the Atlantic Council. You are one of the great Atlanticists as well. I got to know you very well during 9/11 when you were ambassador to NATO. So thank you for your service, not just to global affairs, but also to Atlanticism. My question has to do with technology, and a lot of questions have circled around this, but can you give us your assessment of where we are in the artificial intelligence race and what the stakes are? Energy Secretary Chris Wright has compared it to the Manhattan Project, but of course, the Manhattan Project was going after one bomb against one other power in a very limited period of time. So I'd love you to assess where we are, and then how can you measure who's winning this race, and what are the stakes?
Well, first of all, Fred, I remember coming over to the Atlantic Council in 2007, a long time ago, to congratulate you on taking over the leadership, and to see the expansion of the Atlantic Council into a global institution has been remarkable. And to see this new headquarters. I think I've now been in 3 headquarters of the Atlantic Council since you took over. It's really, under your leadership, it's been a very important elevation of the Atlantic Council. So congratulations on that.
I took your advice.
So I think that if we were here 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I'm not sure most of us would say, well, technology is center stage. I think it's center stage. I think it's the most sensitive, and probably in terms of where this relationship will head, which country will emerge more powerful, more influential in the world, may be a function of which of us is first mover and first adapter, because China is very good at adapting on some of these technologies. And it's hard to kind of take a snapshot and say who's ahead, but it does, I think, give both President Biden, certainly, but President Trump an incentive to be very closely supportive of our tech companies. This is so different than the Manhattan Project, conceived by the United States government, innovated by the United States government, fully owned and operated by the United States government, with no private sector involvement in the operational nature of nuclear weapons since 1945. I often thought of this as the American tech companies versus the Chinese tech companies. And certainly on AI, on quantum, on biotech, that's what it comes down to. And so I think the Trump administration has been right to have a very senior person inside the White House, David Sachs, essentially as the very close liaison with Silicon Valley and in terms of biotech with my hometown of Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very important that President Trump himself has been so much in touch with the tech leaders in the United States. And some people criticize President Biden for engineering a little, reintroducing industrial policy. But as China so heavily subsidizes its own quantum companies, biotech companies, national champions on AI, we have to do the same. And I think that, whoever moves ahead and has a degree of international, if for lack of a better word, dominance on these issues is probably going to emerge as a more powerful country, given the transformative nature of AI in particular. So far be it from me to say who's ahead in the race now, but it does mean that it's very important that the United States government, and here I'll be critical of the Trump administration, stop its campaign of trying to deny to our major research universities federal government funding for science and technology programs. Walter Isaacson, who knows a lot about the growth of American technology from the Manhattan Project on, has this very simple diagram. He says, think of what made America a great industrial power. The triangle. Federal government at the top of the triangle since the Manhattan Project has funded universities under a social compact. These are not gifts. That the best people in our society who can innovate, who can conceive, are university students and professors. Think of Caltech. Think of Carnegie Mellon. Think of MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that those ideas are then monetized by the private sector. And Walter says that's what made America a great industrial power. That's still true. So if the administration is now embarked on a campaign to deny Harvard, the university where I teach, federal funding, it's just going to hurt the American people. And it's going to hurt the American power base. One example, 2 of the 3 COVID vaccines came out of Harvard labs. And so this was a direct benefit to the American people and people around the world. But in terms of national security, really important that our defense industrial base be completely linked to our best research universities. And that is not now the case. And the social compact, the so-called compact offered to the 9 universities beyond Harvard, I think good to see that 8 universities have 8 of the 9 so far, turned down the administration, because you need to have universities free of government control so that university students and professors can innovate, conceptualize, and do what they've always done. I worry about that more than anything else. Funding for NIH, funding for the Centers for Disease Control, funding for Caltech, because that is the secret power of the United States. And if you go to Tsinghua, and you go to Nanjing, and Fudan University, and Zhejiang, and Chengdu, they are getting lots of subsidies from the government of China and from the provincial governments, eventually to compete with us in all these spheres we've been talking about. So that worries me almost more than anything, Fred. It's something that the Trump administration, I think, would do well to reconsider, because it's been a failing policy over the last 10 months.
We have a lot of questions right back here. Yeah, the woman here.
Oh, yes. Thank you, and thank you for your service in the conversation today. My name is Tracy Brady. I was wondering, you spoke earlier about allies for the United States and the importance of those relationships. Can you talk a little bit about China and their allies or access with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and how you think that is changing or not? Thank you.
So this leads us to that September 3rd parade in Tiananmen Square to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And that incredible photo of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, the Iranian president, all walking together. And some people say, well, it's not really important, it's just a parade. But think about the 4 countries involved. Iran mass-producing drones for the Russian war effort in Ukraine. North Korea, volunteering soldiers to die in Ukraine for the Russians. China, which for the entire length of the war tried to convince me and members of our government that they were strictly neutral and just wanted peace, supplying, as Tony Blinken said publicly many times, 90% of the dual-use technologies and microelectronics that power the Russian defense industrial base. They're in it together. And from a larger sense, if you look at the global security initiative of President Xi Jinping, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the most recent global initiative just, I think, surfaced at the UN General Assembly last month, there's now a construct of theological Xi Jinping thought and foreign policy that essentially doesn't agree with the liberal world order constructed in the wake of the Second World War, wants to water it down and make it more friendly to authoritarian countries. So that's a battle of ideas that the United States has to take on with the Japanese, with the Europeans, with other democratic countries in the world. And if you have now deconstructed and taken off the air Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, and unceremoniously fired 8,500 people at USAID in 1 week in February, you've made it very difficult for the United States, the Trump administration has, to compete in this public, very public battle of ideas with the Chinese leadership about which system, which government, which country represents a better view of the future for the rest of the world. And that really worries me, that we've tied now two hands behind our back in this very public battle. We called it my mission, our mission in China, the US mission, a battle of ideas. It's their ideas over communism, communist orthodoxy, versus our ideas of what a democratic society looks like. I really worry about that too. And I hope, very much hope, that at some point we're going to recreate some version of AID to compete with the Belt Road Initiative and some version of the Voice of America, or bring it back in its entirety to compete with CGTN and CCTV and the incredibly strong Chinese efforts being made on social media to distort our positions and our society. This was a battle we tried to fight every single day when I was ambassador, and I really hope we've got a very good ambassador. I wanted to say that today, in David Perdue. I think he's extremely capable, very well experienced. I just have watched him from afar and really admire the job he's doing. We've got good people at US Mission China, in Beijing, in Shenyang, in Wuhan, in Guangzhou, and Shanghai, but they need support for this battle of ideas. So thank you for asking about it.
Great, so why don't we do 2 questions, Zoltan, and then the gentleman right behind you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Burns, welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you for your terrific service as U.S. Ambassador to China. My name is Zoltan Feher. I'm with the Global China Hub here, working on EU-China relations, EU-US-China relations, and I'm a former student of Ambassador Burns at the Kennedy School, a proud former student. And I wanted to ask you about something you've mentioned a couple of times today, which is the need for the U.S. to work together with allies. Because you and I agree with your statement. We agree that it is very difficult for the United States to meet the challenges that China poses in all of the different domains alone. The United States needs to work with allies, work with the European allies primarily. I wanted to ask you what you think are the main obstacles currently to that coordination. Obviously, you mentioned, the tariff war, Liberation Day hasn't helped. What are the main obstacles to closer transatlantic coordination on China? And what are your experiences working as U.S. Ambassador in Beijing with your European colleagues there?
Thank you, Zoltan, and very good to see you. I'd say this, China has 14 neighbors and border disputes with a great majority of them, and doesn't really have another country, even the Russian Federation, they can count on the way we counted on our allies on 9/11 when, as Fred said, I was the US ambassador there. And led by Canada, the European allies and Canada came to our defense on 9/11. China has nothing like that. So that's a big advantage for the United States as we think about this competition. Frankly, we were really lashed up very tightly with the EU, with the NATO countries, particularly with the Indo-Pacific allies, the 5 treaty allies, New Zealand, Singapore, India, in addition to the 5. And it's because we have very similar experiences with China. We all want to live in peace with China. We all want to trade with China, but don't want to be dominated by China. And so it wasn't difficult to make these connections. And I thought President Biden, one of his signature achievements was strengthening our alliance with Japan, was helping Japan and South Korea to overcome their differences from the Second World War, was drawing India, and this is a bipartisan effort, ever closer to us in terms of our air and naval cooperation in the Bay of Bengal and the Western Pacific. And so it was a high watermark, I think, of the administration. And I really wish the Trump administration the best with this, and I hope they can return to leading through the allies and with the allies. It's a much better way to think about how you sometimes diminish Chinese tactical and strategic power in the world. And I would say this, I think the Chinese were very concerned about the fact that the Philippines flipped when President Marcos came in and opened up bases to Japan and the United States. When the Japanese under Prime Minister Abe, the late Prime Minister Abe, agreed to spend as a floor 2% of GDP in defense. Australia with the AUKUS deal, and I thought it was very good that President Trump, he said he supported the AUKUS deal yesterday when he met with Prime Minister Albanese. So, look, I think that the Trump administration has done many things well when it comes to our relationship with China. But for me, ultimately, it's being connected and working through our allies that gives us a decisive tactical and strategic advantage against the Chinese, which we should want to have in this long-term competition for power.
And I should say Zoltan has been doing work over the past year with our colleague Valbona Zanelli, who's based in Italy, to assess Europe's shifting policy toward China. So stay tuned. Almost done. So this gentleman here, and then I saw there was a question right behind him. If we can get you guys, so we can get 2 questions this round.
Thank you, Ambassador Burns, for your comments. My name is Nayan. I'm with Indo-Asian News Service, previously with Voice of America, China Division. I have questions specific.
Thank you for your service to Voice of America.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very sad. So my question is regarding the Quad specifically. Ironically, the first Trump administration revived the Quad, but this time around there doesn't seem to be much appetite in terms of strengthening it. What are your views on that? Why is it happening? And you mentioned you were in India a few days ago. What were your biggest takeaways from the country, given what's happening in the relationship right now? Thank you.
Well, the Quad, I think you're right to remember that the Quad began in 2006 and 2007. When I was Undersecretary of State, I participated in some Quad meetings, but never at the head of government level. And, President Trump's the one who made it a head of government exercise in his first term. I know that there was an early meeting this year. Secretary Rubio participated of the Quad foreign ministers. At some point, I think I've heard they want to have a head of government meeting, and I hope they do. It's a way to cement our relationship, Japan, Australia, and the United States, treaty allies, with India, and to keep India closely knit to us on security affairs. So I do hope it happens. And obviously, we said back in the George W. Bush administration about India that the strategic rise of India was in the world, was in the national security interests of the United States. Because we could already see, even in the George W. Bush administration, that we would have this long-term competition, rivalry with China in the Indo-Pacific, and India's involvement with us in a peaceful way would be critical. And so again, you have trade-offs in diplomacy. You put 50% tariffs on India, you're going to have a crisis with India. And maybe that harms your ability to have a fully effective defense relationship with the Indian government. I would choose the defense relationship, frankly, over tariffs if you have to choose. And sometimes in life and in diplomacy, you have to choose. So that's how I'd answer your very good question.
Hi, Mr. Ambassador. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I'm a DC correspondent for Caixin Media from China. My name is Seng Jia. So my first question is, at approximately what percentage do you think U.S. tariffs on China might eventually be settled? And my second question is, in an era where leader-level diplomacy is the dominant force in shaping foreign relations, how do you see the evolving role of ambassadors? Thank you.
Thank you. On the first question, I think President Trump said, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4 days ago, he felt that 157% effective tariff rate between China and the United States would not be sustainable, and he's right. But from the beginning, I mean, I took issue with President Trump placing high tariffs on our allies, and we've talked about this here. But it didn't bother me as much the way President Trump had a very forceful position against China. Because part of my job, Melanie's job, sitting back in Washington at the State Department, was to object to, you can speak for yourself, obviously, I'll just speak for my view from the field. There is not a level playing field for the thousands of American companies in China, still today. We've been talking about these issues for a generation. Forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, huge subsidies given to Chinese competitors of American companies. And so I think President Trump has been right to be tough. And I don't know where they're going to end up, the two countries, in terms of where the effective tariff rate is going to be. It's not going to be at 0. We know that, and the Trump administration has been clear about it. But that's going to be a signal issue in the trade talks. On the second question, sure, ambassadors are still useful. You need people, you know, there's a very capable Chinese ambassador here in the United States, Ambassador Xie Feng, very smart person, experienced. And you need people who can tell officials in Washington who he speaks for the Chinese government, here are our views on a granular basis, every day, at every level. You need an American ambassador. We have a very good ambassador, David Perdue, doing that in Beijing. But the second role of an ambassador, and this is particularly important at this time in China, is your ambassador of the entire country. And so the extent to which Ambassador Perdue can travel outside, and he's been doing this, outside of Beijing, talk to university presidents, meet students, visit Chinese companies, visit the next generation of leaders at the provincial level, recall the wartime alliance that the United States had with China, lay flowers in Yunnan at the memorial for the 1,600 Americans who died in the air travel, the hump operation between Assam, India, and Kunming. This is a really important job. And I'm glad, we've had some outstanding people, John Huntsman, Gary Locke, Terry Branstad, and now we have a really good ambassador in David Perdue. So of course ambassadors are useful in the world. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years in that respect, but thank you for your question.
So let's take one final question back here.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm Philip Ramirez. I'm a Military Skillbridge Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. You alluded to the anti-corruption campaign and the result of those in your comments. I'm curious what your thought is on the most recent party purges, particularly in the Central Military Commission. Yeah. I believe the news broke last week that the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission was taken out of that position. What I find particularly interesting about that is that while anti-corruption purges are not new to Xi Jinping in his tenure as party secretary, he has had a lot of time to put people in charge of these different state and party organs over the last decade. So how should we be looking at these most recent high-level purges? Are they truly about anti-corruption or competency, or is there something else going on here?
I think it is what it is. There's been, if you go back to 2012 and 13, almost a permanent campaign. The Chinese government talks about this and is open about it, labeled anti-corruption. But to see the dislocation in the PLA and the upper ranks of the PLA, frankly, has been surprising to see it continue. I think I talked earlier in this session about what happened, some of the cases when I was ambassador, but now it's continuing in 2025 at a very high rate. So draw your own conclusions as to what it means. But it's unusual, no question about it.
So thank you very much. And in closing, I do want to point out, I think that a lot of observers miss the degree of deep bipartisanship in U.S.-China policy.
Yeah.
You were the Biden-appointed ambassador to China, and you're saying very nice things about Ambassador Perdue, who I think is great as well. I heard him speak
And I mean them.
this summer. Yeah.
Sincerely mean them.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, I appreciate how clear you've been on that. I think there's a lot of bipartisan agreement and collegiality and team approach that sometimes gets missed in the drama of the day.
Can I just say, because my wife Libby always tells me, try to end on a hopeful note, because she says I depress everybody when I talk about all these problems out there in the world, and she's probably right. I want President Trump to succeed. Of course I do, as a patriotic American. And he's up against a really powerful set of forces in China. So, there's certain things which in our democracy we have a right to say, I would have done them differently, or I'll criticize here. But I think his basic view is that he's going to be centrally involved in this relationship, that he needs to meet with President Xi is correct. I wish President Trump and Secretary Bessent well on these trade issues. And then I hope as they begin to negotiate the entire complex of issues, of course we want our government to succeed.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Great note to end on.
Thanks for what you're doing here, Melanie, at the Atlantic Council to bring China, this discussion of China, to the level that you have.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.